Thank you very much, Dave. Well, I am delighted to introduce to you, those of you who have not had a chance to meet him yet, Anders Wijkman. He has been a mainstay for the Club of Rome for a long time and really been in the business of trying to change the world since a long time ago. I'll ask him later whether it was before or after Limits to Growth, but it was published, but he's about the same age as I am, so it probably was simultaneous. The key point is that Anders has been one of the co-presidents of the Club of Rome for a while now. He has been a member for a long time. He has been important at advancing the issue of circular economy, of various levers and focuses that can be added to the way in which people and industries work. And he's going to tell us as well about a book that he's been about to produce, focusing most on the circular economy. So what I would like to do is, rather than spend a lot of time, because he's on Wikipedia and he has an excellent website that tells us a very long list of things that he has done, and he's worked with the UN, he's worked with Europe. I would rather you listen to him. So I'm very delighted, Anders, to introduce you, and we will be having questions for you, which I will try to organize to make them logical when at the end of your session. So that.
But thank you very much for the invitation and this opportunity to be with you and to share some of my thoughts about a concept that is quite familiar to people, but which in fact doesn't have a clear definition yet. It's more of a metaphor, but it's all about materials and material efficiency. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is that I think, at least with regard to the debate on climate change, the material aspects and material throughput have been largely neglected over the years. We have focused almost all our attention to energy, and that is natural because fossil fuels make up still today 81% of the energy mix in the world. But the other side of the coin has to do with materials. And I'm going to show to you how important it is that we rethink the way we deal with materials, and that we have to go from a linear production model to something that is much more efficient and circular. I would also like to say at the outset that it's not easy to talk about these more long-term issues in a situation where people not so far away from where I sit in Stockholm are being slaughtered by Putin's aggression. I have several Ukrainian friends in Sweden, but I also have some in Ukraine, and follow this every day like you do. And it's just unbelievable that, again, in Europe, we are in a situation where people are suffering badly from warfare. We didn't think this would be possible again after all that we have experienced. But I guess at the same time, we have to recognize that there are a number of existential threats to mankind. And we have to address them in a systemic way, and they are also interlinked. Whether we talk about pandemics, climate change, ecosystem degradation, biodiversity loss, gross inequities and social exclusion, and now also warfare. You can't solve one problem at a time. You have to understand the interconnectedness. So I'm going to talk about materials. And let me start by sharing with you this slide, which most of you probably have seen before. Normally, it's not, the heading is not the Anthropocene, it's rather the big acceleration. It's a slide that I borrowed from the scientific group who presented the planetary boundaries some years ago. And this slide will sort of demonstrate the enormous expansion in all areas of demand over the last 50 to 60 years. On the right-hand side, you have socioeconomic trends dealing with everything from population to energy use, water use, transportation, etc. And on the right-hand side, you have the sort of consequences for the Earth system in terms of increasing emissions, deforestation, ocean acidification, etc. If you look at it in a more simple way, here you have a graph from the European Environment Agency that shows us what's been going on over the last 50 years in terms of GDP. GDP is the black line here. The red line is the material footprint, and you can see that GDP and material footprint is almost parallel. And the green line or the blue line, whatever color it is greenhouse gas emissions. And there you see over the last 10 to 15 years that the relationship is not as close as it used to be. I'm not saying that we have a decoupling going on, but at least we have not the same strong relationship. But still, when the economy grows, greenhouse gas emissions also grow. The last or most recent IPCC report told us that we are not on track for 1.5 degrees. We are not even on track for 2 degrees, depending a little bit on what scientists you listen to. The prediction now is that unless we do much more in terms of mitigation, we are going to end up somewhere around 3 degrees of warming towards the end of this century. And in the words of Jim Hansen, an old friend, I happened to be, by the way, in Washington when he was giving his testimony in the Senate in the late 1980s. According to Jim Hansen, a 3 degree warmer world is another world, is a totally different world. And it will be very, very difficult for large parts of humanity. But it's not only climate change that is affecting us. We have ecosystem degradation. This picture is from Amazonas and shows us how deforestation is ongoing. This one tries to illustrate the decline of insect populations in different parts of the world. And here is a slide I borrowed from WWF, which I think is quite drastic. The gray, the gray in the picture or in the slide in the middle, that's us humans. That's our body weight, the accumulated or aggregate body weight. The light gray is our husbandry, and the green dots on the margin, about 3%. That's the aggregate body weight of wild animals. If we had this slide some 100 years ago, it would of course look very, very different. So it just shows how we are as humans, how we are really turning wilderness and wild landscapes into something totally different. I listened to David Attenborough a few months ago, and he told us about his life, and it was really interesting. He started to travel around as a photographer in the late 1930s. And he said at that time, the estimate was that 70% of the land area was wilderness. And then he paused and then he said, today, some 60 to 70 years later, it's only 30% left. So that really reminds us what's going on. We have, as you know, not only the IPCC, which is a scientific panel, we have also the IPBS, which deals with ecosystems and biodiversity. Bob Watson, who used to be the chair of IPCC many years ago, he is now the chair of the IPBES. And this statement from him, I think, is quite accurate. He says, for a long time, people just thought of biodiversity as saving nature for its own sake. And then he refers to the most recent IPBES report, and he says, but this report makes clear the links between biodiversity and nature and things like food security, clean water in both rich and poor countries. And I think that's an important reminder, because I think to many people still today, biodiversity is something very abstract, but it's for real, of course. When we look at climate change, we have been experiencing a lot of wildfires. We see that sea ice in the Arctic is melting and getting thinner. Glaciers are also disappearing and melting. So there are obvious examples and evidence that we are in for a much warmer and very different world. My friend Johan Rockström talks a lot about tipping points, and I listened to him the other day, and I borrowed this slide from him, and his message was that tipping points are for real. The climate system is not a linear system. It's a system where we can expect threshold effects or tipping points. The problem is we don't really know when and to what extent. And here they have tried to illustrate some of the most salient tipping points. Everything from the green line ice sheet starting to melt and melting indefinitely. We have permafrost starting to melt. We have the Amazon rainforest being turned into a savanna, etc. The problem with all this is, of course, that once something like this happens, there is going to be a lot of changes on the planet, regardless of whether we are able to curb emissions or not. Now, from the point of view then of climate change, what do we do? Well, most of the scientists seem to agree that in order to meet the Paris Agreement and hopefully not exceed 1.5 degrees of warming, we need to halve emissions every decade from now until 2050. And that's what they call a global carbon law. And I would like to submit that to do that is a very, very tall or very, very difficult thing. I've been involved in climate policy making now for the last 25, 30 years, primarily in the European context. We were very proud in 2008 when we took a decision to cut emissions by 20% in the European Union, territorial emissions, until 2020. And that meant between 1 and 1.5% per year over a 12-year period. That we thought at the time was ambitious. Now we know we have to move down to almost zero in terms of emissions within a few decades. And that is not incrementalism, that is really transformation. And to reduce greenhouse gases by a few percentages here and there, you can do within the present system, the economic system. Transformation is different, and you have to work in all major sectors and do mitigation very, very aggressively. The energy system, infrastructure, buildings, basic materials, agriculture, forestry, textiles, electronics, you name it. And as I said in the beginning, so far, most of the focus have been on energy use. But my point tonight is, or today, it's evening in Sweden, sorry, is that material use is crucially important. And here you can see from the International Resource Panel how material use have grown over the last 50 years. It's a tripling of material use since 1970. And when we talk about materials, it's everything from fossil fuels to biomass to metals and minerals. And one of the interesting things in the work of the International Resource Panel, and I'm one of the members, is that we have come to the conclusion when we have analyzed how materials matter, that 50% of global carbon emissions and as much as 90% of biodiversity loss is directly related to the extraction and processing of materials, fossil fuels, and food. And if you look at some basic materials like cement, steel, aluminum, and plastics, they make up almost 20% of global carbon emissions. This you can read about in Global Resources Outlook from 2019, which is one of the flagship reports of the IRP. OECD has had a similar report with more or less the same conclusions. So when we look at it more in detail, you can see here biomass, that's of course wood, crops, fuel, feedstocks, plant-based materials. You have all the fossil fuels, you have the metals, iron, aluminum, copper, etc. And you have minerals like sand, gravel, and limestone. And it's when you pull all this together that you get this tripling of material use over the last 50 years. And our estimate when we look at into the future is that unless we become much, much more efficient and intelligent in our use of materials, they are going to double in volume within the next 25 to 30 years again. And I would submit that we have not focused enough on how we manage natural resources. And they sit at the very heart of the challenges that we are discussing, like climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and a lot of health impacts. And if we understand that better, it provides us with something of a message of hope, that by being more clear about the root causes of the problems that material use cause, we can deliver policy responses that can tackle them efficiently. But here you have an example of the challenges. Because of urbanization and population growth, in particular in low-income countries, and some of the most rapidly industrializing countries, our estimate is that more than 50% of the urban fabric that we will need in the world of 2050 doesn't exist today. It needs to be built or constructed. And to illustrate what we are talking about, if we look at China, which has had a very, very rapid development, as you know, with an economic growth of roughly 10% per year during decades. In the 3 years of 2011 to 2013, China used more cement than the US did during the entire 20th century. This is not to point finger at China because their population is so much bigger, but it illustrates what we are talking about when millions and millions and millions of people are moving into the cities or are being born in these countries. If you look at some of the more specific materials like aluminum and cement, you will see here what the expectation is in terms of increase in demand. Aluminum, the expectation is that it will increase by between 3 and 4 times in terms of use over the next 75 to 80 years. Cement will about double. Steel will more than double. Plastics there we see a continued increase. Of course, at least today, more or less 100% of plastics is produced using oil and gas. If we look at clothing and textiles, we have a doubling of the volumes since 2000. And textiles and clothing, including, of course, fast fashion, make up something like 8% of carbon emissions globally every year. Here we have another picture which demonstrates the rapid increase in demand for plastics. So this is really the background. We have had a huge or very rapid increase over the last 50 years, and that is bound to continue unless we do something. And when we have looked at it in the European context, and the situation is more or less the same all over the world, the problem is that on average, we only use materials once. We talk about recycling, we talk about reuse, but even when we recycle, most of the materials are not really ending up being used again. They end up either in landfills or in incineration. So we have a material system that is very, very wasteful. And as I said, even with high recycling rates, the materials are poorly utilized. I was for 7-8 years chairman of the Swedish Recycling Industry Association. And I was always asked by people, now that we talk so much about circularity and circular economy, the companies, the recycling companies must be making good money. The fact is they don't. Apart from a few areas, the secondary materials market is not really working. And only about 25% of the material value capture after first use cycle is being, no, only 25% of the material value is captured after first use cycle. And when we talk about plastics, it's only 8%. You have the highest, of course, degree when it comes to metals, including aluminum. But even for aluminum, I was astonished that only about 30% is being used again, simply because so much of aluminum is being used in composite materials, and it's very, very difficult to dismantle and use again. So when we look at plastics, electronics, household appliances, building materials, textiles, etc., very little of the material value is captured after first use, which means that huge monetary values are thrown away. And the result is, of course, also serious pollution, a lot of unnecessary carbon emissions. If you take, for instance, aluminum, to produce aluminum from bauxite requires a lot of electric power. If you can recycle and reuse, you save 90% of that energy, meaning 90% less carbon emissions in today's economy. So here we have really a problem. Another problem that is related to this is that infrastructure and products very often are very poorly utilized. Here you have 3 examples. The mobility system. We own, most of the households in well-to-do societies, they own their own vehicles. They stay idle 95% of the time. Of course, that's a very inefficient use of resources. In the built environment, we know that, for instance, offices, they are not occupied for more than 15-20% of the time. And the food system, we know that at least 1/3 is wasted. So you have this dual challenge. On the one hand, materials are not captured after first use and disappearing or dissipating or being lost. And then on top of it, you have poor utilization of many of the more resource many of the areas where a lot of resources are being used to provide the services we need. Another factor we have to take into account is that the material footprint looks very different. In my country, Sweden, we have a material footprint of roughly 25 tons per year. In Africa, south of Sahara, the footprint is around 2.5 tons. And of course, the poverty-stricken countries, they have to increase their material use to attain a better living standard. But if it would end up at the level of 25 tons per capita, like we have in Sweden, that would of course mean a disaster for the world in terms of emissions, in terms of biodiversity loss, etc. So the real challenge is, how do we reduce the footprint in the rich countries, and how do we increase the footprint in low-income countries, but do it in a way that the equation, the total equation, means that we don't cross the planetary boundaries and that we can develop a more sustainable economy. This I put in as a slide just to show that purchasing power matters. This slide shows you the tons of CO2 per capita per year for different income groups. And if you look at it more carefully, for people with low incomes, the carbon footprint is quite low. But if you approach $80,000 or $100,000 a year, you end up with 40, 50, 60 tons per year. I saw that Abramovich, one of the oligarchs who is much talked about these days, the estimate was that his footprint is around 7,000 tons a year. So this just shows that purchasing power is a very important and decisive factor. And here is another picture which shows the electricity consumption per capita in some African countries. And at the right-hand side, you have what an average fridge in a country like Sweden or the US would consume, roughly 450 kilowatt hours per year. And in these countries, Ethiopia, Tanzania, etc., people have less electric power to use than what a single fridge would require. So this shows the inequity here. And I think when we talk about efficiency, we have to take this really into account and start discussing in terms of sufficiency and not only efficiency. Now, this then leads me to this terminology, moving from a linear production model to a more circular and resource efficient model. And as I said, there is no good definition of a circular economy. There are attempts now by the International Standards Organization to come up with a definition. They have been working on it for several years, and the expectation is that sometimes in 2023 they will try to come up with something that countries could agree upon. And why is that important? Well, it's important because if you don't know exactly what you're talking about and what your target should be and how you measure it, it's very difficult to move in the right direction. But right now, circularity or circular economy is a metaphor for renewables, resource efficiency, and closing the loops. And I would add, of course, nutrient recycling, because there is a tendency when you talk about circularity only to focus on the technosphere, but the whole concept derived from the biosphere. So, of course, circularity or the circular economy should include both the technosphere and the biosphere. And what we talk about is to extend product life. The longer a product can be sustained and can be used, the better. And that means building less obsolescence into the products. Other concepts that come to mind is, of course, reuse, repair, maintain, remanufacture, recycle. Nutrient recycling, I already talked about. Another interesting concept that is being referred to more and more is to move from selling products or stuff to offering services. If a company still owns what it produced and offers it for leasing or renting, the design will probably be different, because the company would like to earn revenue as long as possible on what they have produced. So there is sort of a very important aspect and a big difference between producing something and selling it, and then don't bother so much about the future, compared to being the owner and trying to keep alive products and materials as long as possible. Another aspect of the circularity is, of course, to utilize better what is already produced. The vehicles or the mobility system in cities come to mind. And finally, there's more and more talk also about the sharing economy. I want to make very clear that nothing is 100% circular. I would rather prefer a terminology like a spiral economy, because you always lose quality in each conversion. But I think we cannot change that. Circularity is there as a concept, but we have to be mindful of the fact that nothing is 100% circular. And there are rebound effects. And that's something that most policymakers seem to neglect or don't keep in mind. When you make any kind of system more productive, you free up resources. And those resources most often in an economy are being used somewhere else in the economy to demand more resources. So we have to deal with the rebound effects. In the book that Ernst von Weizsäcker and I wrote some years ago, Come On, we have a chapter on that. And we talk about sort of a ping pong effect, where our proposal was that once you have a productivity increase in a system, you have to increase taxes to reduce that extra demand. It's not a popular idea among most policymakers, but I think we have to deal with it one way or the other. As I mentioned, nutrients, recycling, and the agriculture system is very, very important. This picture is from a report that was published only a couple of weeks ago in Europe by something called ESAC. It's the European Academies of Sciences Advisory Council. EASAC. You can easily Google it on their website. It's a very interesting report. It's sort of a desk study where they have analyzed some 250 scientific studies on regenerative agriculture and come to the conclusion that this is a win-win-win thing. And the recommendation is for the European Union to start moving in this direction. I don't have the time now to go into details, but I just wanted to show it so that you can easily access it if you like, and make the point that, of course, the food system has to be transformed. And in my opinion, this is the way to go. One of the Club of Rome members in the US, Hunter Lovins, is an expert on this. John Fullerton, also a member of the Club of Rome, is an expert. So you have a lot of people in your part of the world that work on this. This is maybe not a very good slide. We did a study not only in Sweden, but in 7 European countries some years ago, where we looked at what would happen in the economy if we moved towards more renewables, if we enhanced energy efficiency and material efficiency over a 10 to 15-year time period. And we came to the conclusion, given the preconditions, that we would lower carbon emissions by roughly 2/3, and we would also add quite a number of new jobs, because an economy where you care more for what you have produced and where you focus on maintenance, recondition, remanufacturing and services is more labor intensive than automatic factories. Some friends of mine work in something called material economics. They did a similar study on some of the most carbon intensive industrial areas, production areas in Europe: steel, plastics, aluminum and cement. And they came to the conclusion that by focusing more on material efficiency and circularity, Europe could cut away around 55% of carbon emissions until 2050, just by doing that alone. So to me and to many who have worked on this, to move towards more resource efficient economies, to move from linear production to more circular production makes a lot of sense. And most people also, when you talk to them, say, yes, of course, that's the way we should do it. So it's obvious, and yet so slow in the making. We have been talking about this for decades. It was one of the issues in Limits to Growth, by the way. Their material, the material metabolism and the way materials are being used was one of the main issues. So then the question is, why isn't it happening? Well, I think there are some very good reasons for that. Resources have been cheap and abundant. I mean, before industrialization and in the early years of industrialization, nature was infinitely large and resources were abundant. Secondly, and this is very important, producers normally didn't pay for externalities. The productivity focus, in particular in OECD countries, have been on labor, not on materials. And we tax labor, we don't tax nature. And business models have been favoring high throughput and products that do not last long. And consequently, product design has not been aiming at reuse and recycling. And as I said earlier, secondary materials markets work poorly, simply because in most areas it's cheaper to source virgin materials than it is to source secondary materials. And you also have quality aspects. We don't have a system of quality standards for secondary materials, which we have, of course, for virgin materials. And then I would say also that when we talk about resource efficiency and circularity, almost all the focus have been on waste management. That is to say, downstream. If you really want to do something about this, you have to start upstream with design, and you have to look at the cost structure. Now, in the European Union, we are moving finally towards a more circular economy. The European Commission has taken several initiatives recently, and they are now putting together what they call a circular economy action plan, which consists of a sustainable product policy framework. And there was a piece of legislation just a couple of weeks ago called Sustainable Product Policy Framework. And the idea is that products that are put on the European market should, in the normal case, be easy to reuse and recycle. We have something called the Eco Design Directive, which is focusing entirely on energy efficiency. That will now be broadened and take into account also material efficiency. There's going to be a circular electronics initiative, which is very important because, as you know, the expansion or demand, the growth of demand when it comes to electronics and everything related to the digital economy is very, very fast. And we have extremely limited reuse and recycling in that area. Electronic waste is growing as we speak and causing, of course, a lot of health problems, and meaning that a lot of valuable materials, including metals, are just thrown away. We will have a new regulation for batteries, and that, of course, is very important because we are now moving into an electrification of the economy. The existing policy directives on packaging, plastics, microplastics, end-of-life vehicles and textiles will be reviewed. And we will finally have a strategy and a legislative directive for a sustainably built environment. That means everything that relates to infrastructure and buildings. And mind you, 40% of materials are can be referred to in that sector. So finally then, and I'm wrapping up very soon, when we look at this from a more specific aspect, I think you have to look at housing and infrastructure, nutrition, mobility, consumables, services of different kinds, and communication technologies. And in each and every sector, which are related to human needs, there are quite extraordinary opportunities to meet human needs in much more intelligent and resource efficient ways. Let me take mobility in cities as an example. Some people think that the main challenge is to replace combustion engines with electric vehicles. Then we have done what we should do. I would say that's wrong. Instead, we have to look systemically at the whole mobility system and realize that you have to design cities in a way that it's easier to access different things. You have to make it easier to walk and to bike. You have to expand public transport, and you have to offer mobility services, car sharing, because then you could reduce the number of vehicles in the city. And it's interesting to see that among the younger generation, the wish to own a vehicle is much less than when I was a kid or when I was a teenager. Young people realize that to own your own vehicle very often is just a lot of problems with it. It's much easier to demand for a mobility service when you need it. And in the International Resource Panel, we have calculated that if you do this kind of systemic analysis and approach mobility in large cities this way, you could save maybe 50 to 75% of the materials, and you would reduce emissions and get a lot of other benefits. So this whole idea to look at how human needs can be met in a more intelligent way is, I think, a very interesting approach. And by the way, it also is linked to the discussions we have currently on well-being and welfare, and to start measuring progress in society, not by the growth of GDP, but rather by well-being indicators, and realizing that well-being is not only about material consumption, it contains so many other aspects of life. Finally, if I were to list a number of policy instruments to move the economy from linear to circular production models, I would give priority to the following. First of all, a tax shift. Reduce taxes on labor, increase taxes on the use of nature. Why should it be more or less free to extract resources from Mother Earth? Why should producers and indirectly consumers not pay for the externalities? It's not easy to do it in a global economy, but we have to start doing it. Otherwise, I think this is not going to happen. And one rather easy thing to do would be to remove VAT on reused materials. You already paid tax once. And if you would take that tax away, in Sweden, for instance, where the VAT is 25%, the secondary material markets would get a boost, because today it simply doesn't work well. The second level of priority would be to design products so that they are, both products and materials, so that they are easy for reuse and recycling. And this is interesting because the design community didn't bother about this until a few years ago. But now I can see all over Europe that designers are very challenged by the sustainability concept and by materials being not only elegant and smart, but also turn into something that can last longer. A third priority would be to require that there is a certain ratio of reused materials in new products. That is coming online in Europe step by step in some sectors. Fourthly, we have to understand that material efficiency should be a priority in climate policy making. We shouldn't concentrate only on energy and energy systems, also material efficiency. I think the public sector should give recognition that new business models are needed, and that this idea of turning products into services is something to promote. We could provide for human needs in smarter ways, and then you would have to look at each and every system. I used mobility as a service as an example. Public procurement must lead the way. Public procurement makes up 15 to 20% of the economies all over the world. And of course, if the public sector started to demand for circularity and circular economy in general, that would mean a lot. And lastly, but not the least, we have to address the rebound effect. So to wrap up, I think materials are enormously important in the whole sustainability debate. From the resource management point of view, the coming decades will, I think, be marked not only by decarbonization, but by dematerialization and material efficiency. So I hope that I've given you some glimpses of, on the one hand, the importance of materials, whatever we talk about, climate change, ecosystem decline, or biodiversity loss, but also that there are so many win-win aspects of moving towards a more resource-efficient economic system. And circular or circularity is, of course, part of that equation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Anders. That was most enlightening. And I'm sitting here reading the comments down the side of my screen. And if any of you haven't seen them, there's a lot of very good comments and questions in there. So I think we will have no problems keeping you on your toes. I to point out that in some ways, I think I'm going to end up being a referee between the optimists and the pessimists, because reading the facts, and also several people have given us fairly extensive comments. And rather than ask them to go through each of them, I'm going to try and bunch them. And certainly I'll have Bill Rees on first in a minute. I'll also make the point that Anitra Thorhag had made a number of comments. She had to leave, and she just asked me to summarize a couple of them. And really, she's after preservation and regeneration, and saying without doing that, it's not that anything circular has to be based upon that. But I'm going to go to Bill Rees in just a minute. Just a couple of points I'd like to make. I think we really do have to clearly identify the success stories from all parts of the planet. I worked with circular economy based industrial parks we were trying to establish in Suzhou as early as 1990. And we've been trying to do the same thing in Canada. We've got a thing had a thing with Environment Canada called Success Stories Bank, where we convinced Dow to make all their mattresses out of something else and take them all back, rather than try and make them something that was not recyclable. And that was in the 80s. So I think the idea has been around, but our big issue is to try and get everyone to buy in. So I'm not going to ask you a question because I know you got a lot coming. I'm going to ask Bill to ask the first question. And I don't want you to go down all of the ones. Please read all his comments. They're all valuable in the chat, but please ask Anders a useful question.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hi, Anders. It's been some time.
Hi, Bill. Nice to see you.
Good to see you again, too. I'm rather surprised you didn't mention the role of just economic growth in the recycling economy. My point is that even if we could achieve 100% material recycling, which you know we cannot do, we would still have to double material input if the scale of the world economy doubles. So is not material growth the enemy of the circular economy? You can't have even 100% recycling and double the economy. You still need twice as many houses, cars, whatever it is. And by the way, this isn't going to be solved by efficiency gains, because the most rapid expansion of material consumption has occurred in the 50 or 70-year period during which efficiency gains have been most rapid. And part of that is because of the rebound effect. Anyway, isn't growth the enemy of the circular economy?
You know, I mean, I could have devoted more time to that whole aspect. And if I had known you would be there, I would have done that. Because I read most of your stuff. So I agree with most of it. The problem is when you look at the world and you look at the people in the low-income countries, there is no way we can lift them out of poverty without increasing material use in their economies. The question is, how the hell do we reduce the footprint in our part of the world? And that's where Janusz Potocznik and we have started to write articles about how to provision or provide for human needs and wants in a different way. And the next step is, of course, to try to define some kind of sufficiency level. But I agree with you that now you could say that certain materials are not the problem. But when you lump them all together, it is not, maybe it becomes a proxy, but it's not an ideal way of measuring things. But no, I agree with you that we have to do something that we have never done before: redistribute wealth and income. And how we do that, we try in the Earth for All report that will be presented in a few weeks' time to deal with it, but not in as thorough way as we would like. So yes, you're right. material growth cannot continue on a finite planet. That the limits to growth report said already. But we have to take it in steps. And I think circularity, if you deal with the rebound effects in an intelligent way, it is a necessary step.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not necessary. I'm just saying that if you double the economy, you still double your material throughput, even with 100% recycling. So look, here's the real bottom line. This will be the last thing I say, Ted.
Okay.
You gave us a whole lot of projections into the future. And we're already in overshoot. And I guess I'm going to make the case, in fact, I'm making it as we speak, that these projections are not even theoretically possible without destroying the ecosphere. Given that in exponential growth, each doubling consumes more material in that doubling period, the next 35 to 40 years, say, than has been consumed since the beginning of the whole period of exponential growth in the last 200 years. So all the damages that you showed us early on will be doubled if we double the human presence on the planet in the next 30 or 40 years. And there's simply no space for that, which is why I think we're much more desperate than anyone thinks. We just don't get exponential growth.
No, I agree.
And it's worth having that debate thoroughly in future. And in fact, I think focusing on the assumptions that go behind each of these, because those are probably something we're all going to have to change. I mean, I'm going to move on. We'll come back to this.
Ted, may I just say one thing?
Yeah.
A significant part of the problem has to do with the way we do agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I read about regenerative agriculture, the more fascinated I am, because if you do it right, many of the externalities would disappear, and we would in fact also be able to increase our yields without a lot of fertilizers and pesticides, etc. So that gives me a bit of a hope. So there are some sectors that are more problematic than others. If we manage to replace fossil fuels with solar and wind, and if we can recycle and reuse the materials in a clever way, I think there are opportunities which are not 100% negative in terms of expansion.
I'm going to hand this to Herbert Girardet because he's right in that agricultural sector, and he's not exactly next. Art's next to follow him, but I'd like Herbert, if you're there, to ask the next question. Herbert, you there? Can you put your screen on? Okay, I'll go to Art right now, and I'll come back to Herbert if he's there later. Art, do you want to go on?
Yeah, I've taken the position since back to about 2015 that says the issue is population on all of this, and because humanity cannot come to terms with population, we're destined to leave the matter up to Mother Nature. She will do a population correction for us, and whether or not or how many will survive is the thing that we should be looking at. So really, the as far as I'm concerned, the population correction is going to happen, and nature is going to take charge. And the best we can do is try and do our affairs with the time remaining to make provisions for those people who do survive, such that they can survive in a sustainable way. Anders, your comment on that, please.
Well, I mean, I agree with you that population numbers are important, very important. That's, by the way, in Earth for All, this report that we are launching in a few weeks' time, we talk about 5 turnarounds One, about food system. Second, about energy systems. Third is about empowering women and educating girls and offering reproductive health services and family planning. So I'm all with you there. But in the short to medium term perspective, consumers in the rich countries are the main problem. I mean, our carbon or our material footprints are so large. So if we only focus on population, we will miss the major problem in the short term. But I agree with you, every child that is born deserves a decent standard of living, and that will require energy, water, etc. So of course, if we can level out the population below 9 instead of exceeding 10 or 11, it's of course much better. So I agree, but I don't think it's the only thing. We have to talk about overconsumption in the rich countries and among the well-to-do in low-income countries, because there you have a lot of wastefulness as well.
Thank you.
There, Herbie, hi.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, so I didn't expect to be asked a moment ago, but here I come. So I would just like to raise the question of the difference between technosphere and biosphere. You say that there's no such thing as 100% circularity, but the reality certainly is in nature, we do have 100% circularity. And the reality is that it's very, very hard to kind of find ways of actually getting the technosphere to work in a similar way. Could you maybe comment on that point?
I agree. And there are some areas where there are some experts who have looked into this very, very thoroughly in several areas. Take medical equipment, for instance. It's very, very difficult to obtain high recycling and reuse rates because of hygiene factors, etc. Take infrastructure. I mean, you embed materials in something for maybe 50 or 100 or 150 years. And for some products like fossil fuels and some meat products, they dissipate once you have used them, unless you have a very efficient system. So I agree fully with you. And that's why I don't like the notion of circular economy in the technosphere. That's why I said spiral economy would be better.
Yeah, good. Okay. So
no, I agree. But you have written so much about regenerative agriculture. And so you know this much better than I. But as I said, I'm fascinated by it. Absolutely.
Certainly, historically, we come from regenerative agriculture. For instance, you mentioned China in various places in your lecture. In China and Asia as a whole were basically circular systems. All human waste, night soils returned to the land and so on. I filmed in China and found that system being thrown out. And as a reality today, it's become a totally linear economy, which is really scary given the Chinese numbers. So you mentioned not only the sort of process of urbanization, the materials used within that itself, but also the ecological footprint of China. I mean, particularly when it comes to meat consumption, we are now seeing massive impacts from Chinese pigs on soybean production in the Amazon. So certainly the circularity of the traditional systems is being completely busted and replaced by this utter linearity. So unless China comes on board, I really don't know how we can implement what you're proposing.
No.
Thank you very much, Herbert. Yes, our next comment is from Susan Tanner and then from John McClintock. Susan, are you there? Hi. Please put your microphone on.
A good idea. Thank you. Thank you for that excellent presentation. It was very, very interesting. My concern is that we're going so fast in the wrong direction that it's going to be very difficult to stop the train or whatever you call it that's going in the wrong way. And I hear that there's certain things hopefully happening in Europe. But I guess what I'm wondering, how do we address the underlying problem of this predatory attitude to nature and the fact that we don't seem to actually get it, that we're dependent on the natural world. We think we can exist somehow in a spaceship. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, of course. I was in a discussion about forestry the other day. And I said to one of the forest experts, who, by the way, works for the forest industry, wouldn't it be good to reduce harvesting levels a bit, to let the trees grow a bit longer, so that what we have then you can use for long-lived products a larger ratio? Because when the logs are rather thin, you get, most of it will be residue materials that will be burned or whatever. And biodiversity would gain also. And then he looked at me and he said, well, you know, I agree with you, but we have to be mindful of the fact that much of the forestry industry is owned by people in the financial sector, and they require fast returns. There we are. So it's the short-termism of the economy, and the fact that externalities are not counted for. I'm very skeptical about the financial sector. I've always been, and this idea now that it would green itself, I think that's a lot of wishful thinking. We have to change the policy frameworks for the economy. So I would say, if I would single out one category of people who are really to blame for the situation we are in, it's conventional economists. Absolutely. They are the ones who continue to preach the gospel, that we can continue to grow and grow and grow. And somehow they seem to believe that 100% decoupling is possible, which we know it is not. So, no, I agree with you. It's a predatory attitude, yes. And they don't recognize that nature is our life supporting system. That's the problem.
Thanks very much. I have a very interesting question coming from John McClintock about how we, to what extent can we program people? John, are you on now? Yes.
Yes, I'm on now. Thanks, Ted. And thank you, Anders, for a really very, very interesting and I would say enlightening talk. And it's great to be able to have a discussion with you, because you've been a wonderful voice here in Europe. I happen to be speaking from Poland at the moment, and you really have made a big difference, I think, in many different ways to the debate in Europe. Now, I have a very specific question, and it concerns greenhouse gas emissions. And as everybody knows, these have to come down pretty fast in the next few years. We can't continue to hang around discussing it. We actually have to do something about it between now and 2030. Now, what, in your view, would be the reaction of the government of Sweden and the people of Sweden if there was a scheme of personal carbon budgets? And by that, I mean a citizen like yourself, you would measure your current budget. That's the quantity of carbon dioxide that you emit in 1 year. Let's say, for the sake of example, that it's 12 tons. And you have to reduce that, say, by 10% every year for the next 5 years. And the government's task is to help you do that by changing some, by say putting in some public transport systems, or by giving you a grant to insulate your house better. And it would be, could be voluntary that citizens reduce their carbon emissions by 10% per year, or it could even be compulsory. But the result would be that everybody would have to reduce their emissions by 10% per year for the next 5 years. Now, what would you think of, how would you think the Swedish government and the Swedish populace, how would they react to an idea like that?
Well, we definitely have the technologies to do it because we can measure quite accurately what our carbon footprints are. So I agree with you. It's doable from a more technical point of view. It was more difficult some 50 years ago when I was a member of the European Parliament and I suggested it and I was shot down.
Oh, really?
For two reasons. One was because of privacy, that the state shouldn't interfere with my lifestyle. And the second one was that it was too difficult at that time to measure accurately each and every individual's footprint. But that argument is no longer valid. I think this is a very intelligent and interesting proposal, because I think we should be obliged to address human needs and wants in a different way. Right now, we only measure the level of consumption. We don't analyze how the hell is that, how does it look, that consumption? But consumption is what companies want, what the government wants, because when consumption goes up, things expand, and expansion is what the whole system is built on. But if we can do things in a more intelligent way and do away with a lot of the, what I would call waste and overconsumption, and maybe also positional consumption, you have to have a certain piece of clothing or a certain car to impress on your neighbors, etc. All that. I think we need that debate. And in order for that to be constructive, I think governments have to facilitate such. Yeah, I think it's good. And by the way, together with Janez Potočnik, who used to be Commissioner of Environment and is now chair of the International Resource Panel, we are working on this. Okay. We are working on consumption as the main driver and trying to understand how can we address it without being shot down.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'd like to get in contact with you to discuss further.
Yeah, please do. And
we can make sure that anything comes through us at KCOR, we can make sure you're put in touch. Anders, okay if we put your mailing address on the...
I put it here now.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next commenter is Andrew Welsh, followed by John Mayer. And we still have a number of comments coming along that look rather interesting. So please stick around. We won't shut you off yet. Andrew.
Hi. So I am really fascinated by some of the ideas you put forward. I think almost all of them would work. And you come at this from a very European perspective. So, and I see the most promising moves actually coming from the EU so far. So in North America, we are a plutocracy. We're formally in the background, but increasingly center stage. Two questions, actually. Is the European political environment, in your view, different from what I see around me in North America? And secondly, do you think a lot of this will be driven by the elected or the electorate?
Well, I lived in New York for a number of years in the 1990s. And it was when moving there that I realized that I was a European, because I realized that we are different in terms of attitudes. You shouldn't generalize too much, because you have a lot of plutocracy in Europe as well. My country, we have produced a lot of new billionaires only over the last 5 to 10 years. And believe it or not, socialist Sweden, because when I lived in the US, they said, oh, you come from a socialist country. We have no capital tax. We have no inheritance tax. We have no gift tax. And our tax on property is very low. We tax income a lot, which is, I think, quite bad, in particular in this digital age, when we should probably start taxing. I think we should tax resources and we should tax capital. And by the way, in the new book Earth for All that we will launch, we are introducing or launching this idea of a universal basic dividend, and that dividend should be distributed equally to all citizens, and the income should come from taxing the commons, the use of the commons, whether we talk about forests, mines, other types of natural resources, the financial infrastructure, and of course, internet and the use of our data. But that was a side thing. So I think, yes, Europe is different. And there is a greater acceptance for taxation and to use economic instruments than I've experienced. I don't know Canada. I know US more, I think. My wife used to live in the US for many years, so she follows the US meticulously every day. So I pick up a lot of that. Then the question is, by the elected or by the electorate? Well, I don't think the elected will do their job unless the electorate is pushing. So we have to educate the electorate, and we haven't done that. But I'm a little bit hopeful, because when I see Greta Thunberg's generation, I see a much greater engagement and greater will to act than what I did 10, 15 years ago among young people. So something has happened.
Thank you. I have 4 more questions before we'll close down the formal session. I have a question coming right now from John Mayer and Mike Nickerson. Both of them are going to focus a little more on consumption. And then the last 2 questions will be by Peter McKinnon and John Holland, who I have on my list. At that point, we'll break it off and we can go informal for anybody who wants to stick around and talk. So I will go now to John Mayer, please.
Anders, thanks very much for this. When we do comparisons between rich countries and poor countries, I don't think we discount consumption based on geographic reality. Your example of the refrigerator, I think the countries you mentioned, which I can't quite remember at the moment, it looks like a budget of 2 or 3 kilowatt hours per day per person. That's how I work on energy budgets, and in kilowatt hours per capita per day. And in a northern country, you not only need more energy, you need more material to attain a certain level of survivability. Someone with a budget of 25 kilowatt hours a day in Mexico can live quite well. In Winnipeg, you die. And I just think that there should be an allowance built into these rich and poor to at least acknowledge the fact that in some areas it simply requires more energy to live. What do you think of that?
No, absolutely. I agree. Maybe I found that slide about comparing Africans with a fridge. Maybe it's too simplistic. It probably is.
Yeah, it's common, but it's rich and poor. It's not northerly rich and poor versus southerly rich and poor. That's what I think.
Well, I agree. I agree.
Yep. Okay.
Well,
okay. Thanks very much.
Everyone wants more than their share, John, and we're always seeking excuses as to why we should be on the plus side. Anyway, I will turn it over now to Mike Nickerson, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation there. You're mostly focusing on material and material use. I'm in favor of all the minimization things that you suggested. There's some good ideas. Full cycle nutrient management in particular, I was delighted to see, because as you said, you know, agriculture and the natural world in general has always cycled nutrients, and that's almost a complete cycle. And then there's this meeting of needs, and followed by the meeting of wants. And that's where the consumerism issue comes in. And as I mentioned in the introduction, and my question is, what are the cultural things that we can do, or do you and your organizations consider the cultural shift from consumerism to something more life-based, more focused on relationships, learning, appreciation, and all of those things, as we say, more
More-
fun, less stuff.
Well, I fully agree with you. And one of my very good friends, he died a few years ago, unfortunately, and he was also a member of the Club of Rome, was a Chilean economist, Manfred Max Neff.
Yes.
And he has written beautiful books. And he distinguished between real needs and satisfiers. And satisfiers was most of that stuff. Yeah, it's a pity Manfred is not alive, because he was also a very good speaker and could convey that message.
I loved his comment that the people in the North, in the rich world, weren't smart enough to be poor.
Yeah.
We're going to take a vote on that next.
No, so I agree. But I think Ted, and I think that what is encouraging is a group of nations called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, with Finland, New Zealand, Wales, Scotland, and Iceland. And they work together to try to advance this well-being agenda. And it's about what you talked about. And of course, culture is a very important aspect there. I should have referred to that more.
Can you put the link in the chat there?
Well,
Or
we
we get the link.
we do have something on that, on the KCOR website, and I'll make sure more gets on. So, because that is rather interesting development regarding well-being. Okay, I'm going to put us, I've got two more people before we break, and we get a coffee and a bit of a break. Anybody wants to stick around after that point, we're wide open just for conversations. So I have Peter McKinnon and John Hollins will get the last stab. Peter.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Anders. Most interesting presentation, as others have said as well. My question was a simple one, in that I didn't hear you speak much about energy. And I see energy, of course, as it requires material. So in the context of, even climate change, we have to deal with various types of materials in terms of changing our energy environment. So just in the context, again, also of circular economy, I was just wondering, what about the future of energy? And I give the example of the use of small modular reactors. You didn't mention nuclear power at all, as a local heating and electrical source as part of a circular economy. In other words, cities could have small modular reactors as their local power source, and it could be distributed as appropriate. Thank you.
I used to be pro-nuclear. And this was many, many years ago in the 70s and the 80s. And Sweden built altogether 12 nuclear reactors. So we had half of our electricity from hydro and half from nuclear. Now we have 6 reactors left. And there is a very vivid debate whether we should start a new generation and whether they should be modular small reactor. I'm skeptical because of 2 reasons. Everything we've seen with regard to nuclear over the last 20 years is increased costs. The costs have gone up enormously. And the second thing is that I was on the board of the Swedish company that is responsible to manage the treatment and handling of the high radioactive waste. And I learned during those years how difficult it is and how expensive it is. And I simply don't think that reprocessing, that is to say, using the spent fuel, where there's a lot of energy still, as fuel in the new reactor. I don't believe in that, because I have listened to too many experts who said, don't go there. It's too expensive, it's too difficult, it's too greasy. But I may be wrong. I think a country like Sweden, we could survive on hydro, wind, in particular ocean wind, and solar, and build green hydrogen as a storage medium, and of course have some quite a lot of batteries also. But I'm not saying I'm right. I'm open to what you said. but I'm not promoting it.
Thank you
Well,
very
thank
much.
you.
Andrew,
I think your cost equations, they'll come from the concepts of the large nuclear power plants that were always custom built on a site. And yes, they did always seem to be more expensive every year. Small modular reactors, on the other hand, are going to be manufactured in a factory.
We
So
will
there'll be a set price.
We
Thank
will
you.
schedule a discussion and or debate on nuclear later this year, either on this site or through KCOR, because as we just illustrated, there are certainly more than one opinion and many other sets of data. Anyway, I will move us. I would say, by the way, there's some very, very interesting comments and discussions in the chat. So please make sure you see the chat, because we just can't let everybody on. We just don't have enough time. But I'll give John the last word before we then wrap this up. And Jean, are you there to thank our speaker? I'll get to her. John, you're on. Please unmute your mic. John, you are muted. John, you are muted.
Whiz. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for working so hard for us, Anders Wijkman, for an hour and a half. That's pretty intense. One observation and two observations. The cost of burning coal, oil, and natural gas to make electricity is enormous. We've been talking about it all the afternoon. In that context, I'm not sure the argument about nuclear being too expensive really has much merit. But let me go back to my younger years. I grew up in a European country, and I grew up with rationing until about 1952 or 3, I think. Is that a tool that current electorates would not push their elected representatives to use?
Interesting. We had this discussion yesterday. The group that is together writing this book, Earth for All, we had exactly this discussion. What do we know about rationing today? And how would a rationing policy, how would it be designed? And the recognition that probably we cannot learn much from what happened after the Second World War, because those conditions were different. Now, rationing may happen sooner than we think, because if Russia cuts off all the gas tomorrow, not only to Poland and Bulgaria, but to the rest of the customers, then I think we will have rationing in the short term. There is no other solution, at least not for Germany, Italy, and Austria, because they are so heavily dependent on imports from Russia, and it's difficult to switch over to some else offering that. Well, we haven't had a debate on rationing in relation to climate mitigation over. We haven't had that, and I think we haven't had a debate on consumption and lifestyles either. All the focus has been on the big production systems, engines on the roads, etc. And now in recent times, we focus more on agriculture and on forestry and nature-based solutions, etc. So I think I cannot give a good answer. I don't think I don't know whether the population will be ready. I don't know. Maybe I have my doubts.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anders. Did you want to take just a few seconds to tell the people about the new book you have coming out on this subject? I think it's appropriate to let people have access to it and tell them how they can get it.
You mean Earth for All?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have formed a group of people from the Club of Rome, from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Studies, the Stockholm Resilience Center, and Norway Business School. Norway Business School because Jürgen Randers works there, and he was one of the original authors of Limits to Growth, and he's still very active. And he has designed a new, very interesting economic model. And I think this report is going to be a little bit of a landmark report, and we look upon it as a 50-year follow-up to the Limits to Growth. And we talk about these 5 turnarounds that have to happen. And we focus a lot on social issues, because we have drawn the conclusion that unless you have, unless tensions, social tensions, not plummet, but are reduced, we won't have the trust level in society to deal with the long-term issues. Look at France, how difficult it has been, the yellow vest, etc. And we also have these huge inequalities and inequities in the world, and inside countries and in between countries. So I think this book is going to be quite important, and we have quite good funding. So the launch and the marketing of it will be quite effective. And I would suggest that Kakor would invite maybe Sandrine Dixon de Cleve, who is one of the co-presidents, or Per Espen Stoknes, a Norwegian, who has been the main author. Or I could come back, or we could do it together. We're going to launch it. The printed book will be out in September, but we will have a digital version earlier than that, and we will launch sort of the main content at the Stockholm +50 conference in June.
And we will cover that in detail to all the members on our website too, to help make people understand it's there. Okay, well, I would thank you again, Anders, and I would like to turn it over to our KCOR president, Jean Doherty, to thank you formally.
Anders, it is definitely my privilege and pleasure to have the opportunity to thank you very, very much for a comprehensive and a very enlightening presentation that you made today. As you can tell from the variety and the wide-ranging questions you've been asked, it really has generated a lot of thought and a lot of questions from people. So with that, again, thank you so much for everything that you've given us today. And for those of you who are here, this slide, if you wish to see or to review this particular presentation, it will be put up onto our YouTube site later on today or tomorrow. And you can get access to that using the CanadianCore.com website. That's our website. And looking at the Stay Informed section, if you register for that, you will be given all the information of the new presentations that have gone on. You'd also be able to look at any of the older presentations that we've already had that are listed on our YouTube site. It would be great. And we would love to have you subscribe to that so that you would get the highlights and notifications of presentations that have been made. Likewise, if you're interested in becoming a member of our organization, you are also welcome to look at what we have on the CanadianCore.com website. So again, thank you so much for an absolutely fabulous presentation. And as I said, very thought-provoking and generated a lot of questions. Thank you.
And we are now going to turn this off so people can have an informal, if you want to stick around, talk to each other, pursue some